Imagine a man dead for 9 months, sitting on a throne. His skin has started to come off the bone. His face is sunken, his fingers black. He is dressed in the most expensive robes in Europe, silk, gold thread, a jeweled mitre resting on his decomposing skull. And the most powerful man in the Christian world is screaming at him for 3 hours about crimes he committed in life. This actually happened in Rome in 897, in front of hundreds of witnesses. And what the screaming man did next was so disturbing that within 6 months, Rome dragged him from his palace, threw him in a cell, and strangled him in the dark. The only question left is why? To understand how a pope ends up screaming at a corpse, you have to understand what kind of city Rome was in the 9th century. Forget every image you have of Rome as a holy place. By the year 890, Rome was the most dangerous city in Europe. The empire that had once held the world together was 200 years gone. The legions were gone. What was left was a city of ruins ruled by armed families, and in the middle of those ruins sat the most powerful chair on earth, the papal throne. The Pope was not just a religious figure. He controlled land, he controlled armies, he crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. Whichever family controlled the Pope controlled Europe. So the families came for the throne. Between 872 and 965, Rome would burn through 24 popes. Some ruled for decades, others died within weeks. One pope held the throne for 15 days before he was murdered. The most dangerous family in this game was the House of Spoleto, ruthless, rich, with a plan to permanently control the papacy by installing their own men, generation after generation. Every pope they backed obeyed them, every single one, until one man broke the pattern. His name was Formosus, and the dead body on the throne, the one being screamed at, that is him. Formosus was not born to be pope. He rose the hard way. Missionary, bishop, diplomat. By the 870s, he was one of the most respected men in the church. His name actually means good-looking in Latin, which is a strange thing for history to remember about a man whose corpse would later be paraded through the streets of Rome. Twice in his career, Formosus was excommunicated. Twice he was thrown out of the church entirely. Twice he was pardoned and brought back. He had powerful friends, he had more powerful enemies, and he had a habit of choosing sides nobody expected him to choose. In 891, he was elected pope. The moment he took the throne, the Spoleto family came to collect. They had been forcing every pope before him to crown their men as Holy Roman Emperor. They expected the same from Formosus. Their army was at the gates of Rome. There was no other choice. Formosus crowned the Spoleto candidate, a man named Lambert. He had to, and every chronicle of the time recorded the same conclusion: another pope, another puppet. The pattern would continue. The Spoletans had won again, except that wasn't what happened. While the Spoletans celebrated their coronation, Formosus was already writing a letter, a secret letter, to a foreign king, a German named Arnulf. He begged Arnulf to invade Italy and free Rome from the Spoletans. He promised to crown Arnulf emperor himself, replacing Lambert, reversing the coronation he had just performed. It was the most dangerous gamble any pope had ever made, and it worked. In 896, Arnulf's army marched into Rome. Formosus crowned him emperor. The Spoletans were humiliated in front of all of Europe. For one moment in his entire life, Formosus had won. And then the moment ended. 2 months later, Emperor Arnulf had a massive stroke and rode out of Italy on a stretcher. A few weeks after that, Pope Formosus himself died. He was 80 years old. He died of natural causes in his sleep. but he left a city full of men who had been waiting their whole lives to destroy him. And he left one specific enemy who was about to do something no pope, no king, no human being had ever done before. After Formosus died, the throne sat empty for 15 days. A man named Boniface VI took it and was murdered 15 days later. We will never know by whom. Then the Spoletans put their man on the throne. His name was Stephen. Now, every history textbook will tell you the same thing about Stephen. He was a Spoleto loyalist, a political appointee, a man placed on the throne specifically to take revenge on the Pope who had betrayed his family. That is the obvious story. It is also wrong, because the most important fact about Stephen, the fact that explains everything that comes next, is this: Pope Formosus is the man who made Stephen a bishop. Years before, when Formosus was alive and powerful, he personally appointed Stephen as the bishop of Anagni. Without Formosus, Stephen would have been nobody. A small-town priest history would never remember. The man Stephen was about to dig up, the man Stephen was about to dress in robes and scream at, the man Stephen was about to mutilate, that man had given Stephen everything he had. So again, the question becomes, why? What does a man hate so much that he would desecrate the corpse of his own benefactor? What kind of hatred outlives the grave? If you ask most historians, they will give you the simple answer. Stephen hated Formosus because of politics. The Spoleto family had been humiliated. Stephen was their man. Revenge was inevitable. It is a clean explanation. It is not the real one. Because if it were just politics, Stephen would have done what political men do. He would have denounced Formosus in a speech. He would have annulled a few of his decrees. He would have moved on. He did not move on. He did something no political calculation can explain, because something else had started happening in Rome, something the Spoletans had not predicted and could not control. Rumors that miracles were happening at Formosus's tomb, that sick people who touched his grave were waking up healed, that the dead pope was answering prayers from beyond the grave. In 9th century Rome, this was not folklore, this was politics. If Formosus became a saint, every decision he ever made would be considered divinely blessed. The German emperor would stay legitimate, the Spoletans would stay defeated, and Stephen, who owed his bishopric to Formosus, would be standing in the shadow of a holy man for the rest of his life. A dead pope was about to become more powerful than the living one. Stephen wasn't planning revenge. Stephen was planning erasure. He didn't want Formosus to be remembered as a bad pope. He wanted Formosus to have never existed at all. There was an old Roman concept for this, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. You destroyed the statues, you scratched the name off the monuments, you burned the records, you made the man disappear. But Formosus had been pope. You could not just burn his memory, you had to invalidate his entire existence. And to do that, you needed something no one had ever tried before. You needed to put a dead pope on trial. And Stephen was about to do exactly that. In January of 897, Pope Stephen VI gave an order to his men. Go to the Basilica of St. Peter, find the tomb of Pope Formosus, open it. His guards walked through the basilica in the cold morning. They reached the tomb, they broke the seal, and inside that tomb was something that had been a man 9 months ago. The body had decomposed badly. 9 winters of damp Italian soil had done their work. The smell was so overwhelming that the soldiers covered their mouths with cloth before they could lift him. And they did lift him. Wrapped in linen on a wooden board, they carried what was left of Pope Formosus out of his tomb, but they did not bury him again. They carried him to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the most sacred courtroom in the Catholic Church, the Pope's own cathedral, and Stephen was waiting for him. In the basilica, Stephen had prepared everything: the full papal vestments, the silk, the gold, the mitre, the ring of office had been laid out on a table. The papal throne had been set in the center of the room, and then Stephen did something the chroniclers could barely bring themselves to write down. He did not order soldiers to dress the body. He did not order servants to handle it. He ordered the clergy to do it, the bishops and cardinals who had served Formosus while he was alive, the men who had been ordained by him, who had kissed his ring, who had stood at his coronation, were forced one by one to dress his rotting corpse with their own hands. Hands that had once received Formosus's blessing now pushed his decaying arms into silk sleeves. Hands that had once touched his ring now placed a mitre on a skull where the hair had fallen out. Hands that had once made the sign of the cross at his command now tied his body to the throne with ropes hidden under the robes so it would not fall. This was not a trial yet. This was the warm-up. The basilica was cold, January in Rome, with stone walls and no fires. The clergy sat in rows in silence. The corpse sat on the throne, slumped forward against the ropes, holding it upright, the mitre tilted on its decomposing head. A young deacon, a teenager according to the chroniclers, barely old enough to be in the church, was placed behind the throne. His job was to speak for the corpse, to be the defense lawyer of a dead pope. He had been given written answers to read. His hands, by every contemporary account, would not stop shaking. Stephen rose to speak. He was the prosecutor. He was the judge. He was the supreme authority of the church on earth, and he was charging a man who had been dead for 9 months. The charges were perjury, illegally moving from one bishopric to another, holding multiple bishoprics at once, coveting the papacy. And then Stephen turned to the throne. He looked at the corpse of his benefactor, the man who had given him his career, and he began to scream, "Why did you usurp the Roman see with such ambition?" The corpse did not answer. "Why did you betray the men who put you in power?" The deacon, behind the throne, whispered the written defense in a voice that could not be heard past the first row. "Why did you break the laws of the church?" The chroniclers wrote that Stephen's voice echoed off the basilica walls for hours, that his face was red, that spit flew from his mouth, that at one point during the trial, the corpse, barely held together by the linen wrappings under the robes, slumped sideways on the throne. And Stephen kept screaming, and then something happened that every chronicle agrees on, something that should have stopped the trial. The ground itself moved. An earthquake hit Rome in the middle of the proceedings. Stones cracked. Part of the basilica ceiling fell to the floor. In 9th century Rome, this was not random. This was God. The clergy began to whisper. They believed it. They had been raised on the belief that the earth shook when divine will was being broken, that God himself was responding to what was happening inside the building. Every single man in that room knew what the earthquake meant. So did Stephen, and Stephen kept screaming. This is the moment that tells you who Stephen really was. A 9th century pope in a 9th century basilica, watching the ceiling crack above him while he prosecuted a corpse, and refusing to stop, believing in his bones that God was protesting and choosing to scream over him. There was no fear of God left in him. There was only Formosus. The verdict came down by the end of the day: guilty, guilty on every charge. But the verdict was not the punishment. The punishment had not started yet. What does a man do? What does he physically do? Once he has convicted a dead body in a court of law, you would think the trial itself would be enough. The conviction, the public shaming, you would think that is the maximum a man could do. It was not the maximum, it was the beginning. Stephen walked to the throne. He stood in front of the corpse he had just convicted, and he tore the papal vestments off it with his own hands. The mitre was thrown to the floor. The ring of office was pulled from a finger that came off with it. The body, stripped, was dressed in a peasant's rags. Then Stephen ordered a blade. He ordered the 3 fingers of the right hand to be cut off. In the Catholic Church, a pope blesses with 3 raised fingers on his right hand. Those 3 fingers were the symbol of papal authority. By cutting them off, Stephen was declaring that every blessing Formosus had ever given was now void. Every priest he had ordained was no longer a priest. Every bishop he had appointed was no longer a bishop. In one act, Stephen invalidated the careers of thousands of clergymen across Europe. The body was then carried out of the basilica and buried in a graveyard for foreigners, a final insult to bury a Roman pope in the dirt of strangers. It was over. The trial, the conviction, the mutilation, the burial, everything Stephen had set out to do, he had done. The hate, you would think, must finally be exhausted. It was not exhausted. Days after the burial, Stephen sent men back to the graveyard with shovels. Dig him up. Again. The corpse of Formosus, now missing 3 fingers, was hauled out of the foreigner's grave a second time. They dragged it through the streets of Rome, past the homes of the people who had once knelt before him, past the churches he had once led, and at the edge of the city, where the Tiber River runs cold and gray, they threw him in, to wash away, to be forgotten forever. Stephen had won. His enemy was erased. The body was gone. The robes were torn. The fingers were cut. The legacy was invalidated. He had done what no man in history had ever done, and in less than 6 months, every single thing he had done would be undone by the very city that had watched him do it. The people of 9th century Rome were used to violence. They had seen popes murdered in their beds. They had seen kings poisoned at dinner. But what Stephen had done was different. It was not the murder of a living man. It was the desecration of a dead one. In a deeply Catholic city, in a Catholic century, there were lines that even brutal men did not cross. Stephen had crossed every single one of them. And then the stories started. Fishermen pulled the body of Formosus out of the Tiber. They had recognized it by the linen wrappings that had washed downstream with it. They carried the body to a monastery, quietly, in the dark, and the chroniclers wrote that as the body lay in the monastery, sick people began to be healed near it. The blind began to see. The lame began to walk. The dead pope was performing miracles. Word spread through the city in weeks. The body Stephen had thrown in the river was now a holy relic. The man Stephen had tried to erase was now being whispered about as a saint. Stephen had not destroyed his enemy. He had created one. And the people of Rome, the same people who had stood silent while Stephen screamed at the corpse, picked up torches. In the summer of 897, the streets of Rome filled with men. The clergy who had been forced to convict Formosus turned. The Spoletan soldiers who had protected Stephen turned. Even the nobles who had put him on the throne turned. Stephen's guards abandoned him. The mob reached the palace. They dragged him out. They tore the papal vestments off his body, the same robes he had torn off a dead man 6 months earlier. Now every man in Rome knew what came next. Stephen had built the script himself. He had shown them exactly how to humiliate a pope. The trial, the public charges, the bishops as jury. The body paraded through the streets. The whole spectacle. Rome was going to do all of it back to him. Except Rome did not. Stephen was thrown into a cell, alone, in the dark, and one night in July or August of the year 897, his enemies came into his cell and strangled him to death. No ceremony, no audience, no record of who did it. The man who had needed all of Rome to watch him destroy a corpse died with no witnesses at all. But that is not the end of the story, because what happened 10 years later is the part almost no one remembers. After Stephen was strangled, the city tried to heal itself. A new pope was elected. His name was Theodore II. He would only reign for 20 days before he too died. But in those 20 days, he did something the city had been waiting for. He ordered the body of Formosus retrieved from the monastery. The corpse, missing 3 fingers, missing every honor it had been buried with, was carried through Rome in a procession of candles. Bishops walked in front of it. Citizens kneeled as it passed. Theodore had it dressed once again in full papal vestments. The 3 missing fingers were replaced with carved wax so the hand could give blessings again in death. And he reburied Formosus among the popes of Rome. With every honor restored, the pope after him, John IX, went further. He held 2 synods declaring the cadaver synod illegal. He burned every record of Stephen's trial. He passed a law that no dead person could ever be tried in a church court again. The hatred was over. The damage was undone. The church had reclaimed its sanity. That is what every person in Rome believed. They were wrong. Because at Theodore's reburial, at the procession where Formosus was returned to St. Peter's, one man was standing in the crowd, a young clergyman. He was not weeping, he was not praying, he was watching everything, silent. His name was Sergius, and 7 years later, when Sergius became pope, he would do something even Stephen had not dared. In the year 904, the moment he took the throne, Sergius reinstated the verdict of the cadaver synod. He declared Formosus guilty all over again. He invalidated every ordination Formosus had performed a second time, undoing everything Theodore and John had restored. And according to some chronicles, though historians still debate this, Sergius ordered the body of Formosus dug up. Again. 10 years in the ground this time, the second trial was held. The second guilty verdict was delivered. This time, they did not stop at 3 fingers. They cut off the head, and they threw the headless body of Formosus back into the Tiber, where, according to the chroniclers, it was caught a second time in a fisherman's net. The most hateful man who ever lived was not just Stephen. Stephen was the symptom. He was the loudest voice. But the hatred for Formosus outlived him by 10 years. It hunted a dead man across an entire decade of history. It survived 2 popes. It survived public outrage. It survived a city's attempt to bury it. Hatred, when it gets deep enough, becomes its own institution. Stephen got every single thing he wanted: the trial, the conviction, the desecration, the robes, the fingers, the river. He won every battle he set out to win, and history remembers him for nothing else. Not a single papal decree, not a single sermon, not a single thing he did in the name of God for the 8 months he held the throne of Rome. Just the corpse, just the screaming, just the rotting body in papal robes. He wanted to erase a dead man from history. Instead, he made that dead man immortal and erased himself. Formosus is buried today in St. Peter's Basilica. His tomb is marked. Pilgrims still visit it. Stephen has no tomb, no marker, no grave anyone has ever found. 1,200 years later, nobody knows where his body was thrown. The man who needed the whole world to watch died in the dark, and nobody bothered to remember where.